It is time for our keynote speaker, Kendra Vant. Please, welcome to the stage, Kendra. Kendra, come on up. Kendra is coming to give her talk, The Neglected Art of a Relevant Benchmark and Why You Need One. Thank you very much, Kendra.
It is rather early for a Sunday morning, so I hope that you all have your coffee on hand. But it is a sort of a slower start to the morning, because what I actually want to do is invite you all to sit back, to relax, and to get contemplative. Because I'm going to talk about the times when you need to do less coding and more pondering. I'm going to talk about why this is true, and finally a little bit about how, if you agree with me, then you might be able to sell that idea of putting aside keyboards and picking up whiteboard markers to those around you who might be mistaking haste for speed. Wow, I don't think I've ever seen them quite that big before. I'm like, did my boulders come out okay? They did. To give you some context for where this talk springs from in my perspective, a little bit about me. So I currently run my own consultancy, and I advise mostly boards and executives, but also build teams across Asia-Pac on how to actually build value from data and AI. Before that, I spent 7 years working for a couple of really iconic Kiwi-Aussie brands. I think they both claim to be both. Building, and I claim to be both as well, so there you go, that works out quite well. Building both AI products and the teams that build and deploy and support and maintain those products. Over that time, we launched 8 AI-based products to a global user base of millions. So believe me, I have seen some things. Wheels have fallen off, and for sure, edge cases have been discovered. And much of what I'm going to talk about today is very much informed by those 7 years building and deploying AI-powered products. Another motivation for me, and why I'm always really keen and excited to come and talk at industry conferences like this, community conferences, is that I've now worked commercially in and around the space of building value from data for about 18 years. I started it on the day my twins turned 1, and they just turned 19, so it's a useful yardstick for me. And during those 18 years, I have seen the use of data and AI become more and more pervasive and more impactful on our society, in some great ways and in some not so great ways. And this experience has led me to believe fervently that every single one of us, we all need, at a minimum, to become confident and savvy consumers of data and AI services and products. They're not going away, but we can change and influence how we as a society use and adopt them. They're great tools, but they're very poor masters. And to play my small part in that building of confidence and comfort and literacy around data and AI, I write a Substack, Data Runs Deep, and that covers basically what I'm interested in at the time, but in large part, the opportunities and impacts of data and AI in the world today. So if you like my talk today, and after that you're curious to know more and curious to continue to learn along with me, then you can subscribe and follow my writing on Substack or LinkedIn. So, why on earth a talk on AI practice and relevant or useful task benchmarks at a Python conference? Because in case you were in any doubt at all, and I'm assuming by now you're not, and you're very welcome to leave if you are, but this is not a talk about the Python language. A long time ago, I did use and write Python, and I became mildly proficient at it, but it's not my area of deep expertise, and it's not the point of my talk. So why am I here talking to you at PyCon AU today? Well, there might well be some folk here who use Python and are not at all interested in AI. Although having said that, considering my previous point about being early on a Sunday morning, if you fall into that group, you probably just slept in and skipped my talk and are coming to morning tea. But it's pretty much impossible to work in AI research or AI product development and not be deeply familiar with Python, because it is, for better or worse, and I'm not going to argue the toss in a religious manner about languages, the lingua franca of the AI development community. And because of that, because of the way it really sits centrally in AI research and dev, for over a decade now, Python has been where two communities repeatedly blend. Folks who know an enormous amount about AI and machine learning, but perhaps not a whole lot about commercial software development. And folks who are new to building products derived from patterns and data, which after all is the large part of commercially applicable AI, but they're experienced in building all of the software that needs to wrap around the little explicitly AI bit in the middle of any useful system to create useful things. And Python is a place where those two communities constantly meet and constantly blend as more and more people enter this field, as each new part of AI becomes exciting. And due to the efforts of many, many people and teams around the world, Python provides a very accessible toolset for working with AI. And now that's a bit of a snowball effect because you wouldn't really release a new AI tool without giving it a really good interface into Python. But successful use of Python or any other language in the space of AI requires a lot of domain knowledge about AI, machine learning if you prefer, to assemble pieces of that toolset, the amazing things that are available to us, in a robustly useful way. And just like with any good toolset, there's an enormous number of ways to do something that looks like it's going to work and doesn't really. With the recent popularity and accessibility of large language models, we have lots and lots of new people, again, pouring into the field of AI development, which is absolutely great. And it's also a great reason to talk about some of the non-code fundamentals that it's useful to learn. Wow, check it out. The sun just came up. Hello, isn't that nice? It's a great reason to talk about some of the non-code fundamentals that are really, really important when you're building AI-based products. And actually, the sun coming up and me being able to see you all properly for the first time reminded me of something I wanted to say when I came on stage. The organisers asked me very politely if I would take questions. I love questions. And in actual fact, my talks usually are designed to be short. They're not always short because I ramble a little bit, but I love questions. It's the best part of speaking for me. I really, really enjoy it. So please, while I'm talking, if anything piques your interest and you want to know more, queue up the question because I'm very happy to chat and I'm very happy to continue to chat afterwards. So finally, a caveat before I jump into the rest of the talk that is really about the practice of AI and the practice of thinking about how to build robust AI products. One caveat. The universe of places in which today's AI tools might be useful is very, very broad, and it's getting broader, which is not surprising. And not all of those places need benchmarks. For instance, I'm not going to today talk directly to folk who might be working on AI applications which are primarily focused on things like brainstorming, creativity enhancement, or productivity uplift. In many cases for those, you can get a long way just using the LLMs with someone else's benchmarks. Instead, I'm focusing on something that a lot of people do, particularly in the Australia and New Zealand community, which is focusing on automation, or if you prefer, automation, fully remove a human, not usually possible, semi-automation, or I prefer to call it augmentation of tasks that are done today by a human. And that's where benchmarks are really, really important. So, what sort of benchmarks are we talking about? Because words in English language get really, really overloaded. And while I don't have the power to make them mean what I want them to mean by paying them extra on weekends, I can do the next best thing, which is to tell you what I mean by a benchmark in the context of this talk. Now, there is actually a lot baked into this minimalistic little graphic, so we're going to walk through it. The first really important step when you're approaching the idea of what kind of benchmark do I want and how do I construct it, the first thing, the really, really important step, is to really ponder what is the useful task that you are tackling. And a lot of teams miss this. And I know this because I consult with a lot of teams, and we start here, and often we find that they haven't actually yet figured out exactly what is the useful task they're going to work on. So benchmarks in the context of Kaggle competitions or the context of LLM leaderboards are often focused on a very, very specific task, but it's almost always not a one that the human that you're trying to augment is actually doing in the context that you're considering if you're building commercial software. So for instance, no one is actually intending to replace doctors sitting the MCAT or replace lawyers sitting the bar exam. But that is actually what the benchmarks that are used in leaderboards are measuring. To build a commercially useful product, my very best advice to you is to expand your field of view and look to define your useful task, the thing that you're augmenting a human to do, in the context and the workflow that wraps around the AI bit. So when you have a reasonable idea of the task that you were trying to work with, and this is a really, really iterative process, it's always that beautiful thing of trying to represent a multidimensional and very cyclical process on a 1D piece of paper. It's not like that at all, of course, but we have to get started. When you've got at least a reasonable task of the idea of that task, that useful task that you're trying to work on, the first benchmark that you need is an estimate of how good the performance on the task needs to be useful. Spoiler alert, it had better not be, it has to be perfect. I know that sounds really obvious, but you would not believe the number of conversations I've had with business counterparts when I've been building AI products, and I say, cool, how good does it have to be for you to want to roll it out? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, so if I can get it to make mistakes only 20% of the time, is that cool? And they're like, no. Like, you do understand that 80% accuracy means 20% mistakes. So it had better not be 100%. That's not what AI systems do. And that point alone rules out quite a few tasks because there isn't an opportunity for them to be performed with a machine making a mistake. Or at very least what it does is it sends you back into the loop that says, actually, I don't think you've figured out what the useful task that you're trying to augment or accomplish actually is. So there's often a bit of to and fro between two of those. Next up, you need an estimate of how good you might feasibly be able to get by learning patterns from data. And as part of that process, you want to come to a shared view on whether you're actually tackling a problem that has a definitively right answer. That's become less and less likely, in fact, over the last 2 to 3 years when there's been a huge resurgence in teams working on natural language problems. Is there a real answer to what is the correct summary of this piece of text, or even an image generation? What you want, of course, is therefore to be a reasonable gap between these two benchmarks. If you get that, when you've sat down and done, this is the useful task, this is how good it has to be commercially useful, this is how good I reckon feasibly we might get there, you want to see a nice big gap. If you've got that, then you have your first really good, strong indication that this is a problem that you are probably going to have some impact usefully to work on, and so it might be a good task to choose. And I know this seems unbelievably obvious when I'm belaboring it and spelling it out like this, but far too many teams, particularly those for whom this is the first time they've ever done this, they're really new and excited by this, simply jump right in and we start tinkering with data and code. And how do I know this? Because I've done this myself, albeit it was kind of a long time ago. They jump right in and they start to tinker with the data and the code before they have a clear view of what that useful task is, and before they've taken any kind of a crack at figuring out where these benchmarks might lie. Now, tinkering a little bit is fine. I spent 11 years as an experimental physicist, and I loved tinkering. Getting your eye in, understanding a bit of the nuance of the problem, often looking at the data is part of understanding what the task really is. But more than a day of tinkering before you are having your first crack, because it's very iterative, but your first crack at a useful task and benchmark formulation, that would make me nervous. And it would really make me nervous if we were working in a commercial team together. Because, of course, there is absolutely no guarantee that the lines are going to fall this way up. It is just as possible that you are working in this situation. And it's particularly likely to be true if you're working in a regulated industry or a regulatory adjacent industry, as I tended to refer to accounting, where I spent for the last 4 years leading AI products for Xero. And it's also true if you're working with any kind of workflow that doesn't lend itself to having graceful failure, because graceful failure is what you're looking for when you want to build machine learning algorithms, AI algorithms that are never going to be entirely correct. You need to have a way to gracefully fail out of those tasks. Now, all of this is to illustrate one huge reason to put time and effort into creating a set of benchmarks for that useful task, that problem that is of interest to you. It is simply about taking the time to ponder and figure out to know what is possible, and then direct your time towards possible tasks. There's an enormous plethora, big universe of things you could do. There's often a really small team who's capable of doing the things, and so you really want to take the time to make sure that you're spending your precious life energy on something that you're likely to be able to do. So that's one big reason. I'm going to step through a couple of other reasons why I believe that investing time in constructing benchmarks at the beginning and then iteratively throughout your work is really, really important. This is a big one. And it's becoming, in some ways, bigger as the data sets we work on become more extensive and the machines we like to use to crunch those data sets become more expensive. So back when I was first commercially building machine learning products, there was no such thing as, well, there certainly wasn't LLMs. There was word embeddings. We were using word embeddings. And, we thought the machines were pretty expensive because they cost about $24 an hour, and our runs would take about 48 hours. And so it's like, it's going to cost me a couple of $100 to train this model. And the company I worked in at the time, that was a significant amount of money. That's a tiny amount of money now. So AI can be really, really creative. It's one of the reasons that many of us who build products in this space love working in this space, because it is a super creative field. There's lots of things you can try. There are lots of knobs you can fiddle with, but that leads to, of course, rabbit holes that you can fall down. How many times, okay, maybe you all haven't, but I have heard people say, our LLM is performing better than the baseline. Better at what? By how much? Compared to what is possible, or just compared to what it was when you started? Is it important? Is it good enough to be useful yet? And are you making significant improvements? So one reason why I think benchmarks are so useful and that pondering is so useful, it is to give yourself something to pull yourself back out of the rabbit hole when you realize that, hang on, I'm really enjoying myself, I'm fiddling with all of these knobs, but I'm not necessarily actually making concrete progress towards a useful goal if I'm building this system for a commercial purpose. Why number 2? AI, all the things thinking is rampant. And you might think that's odd from someone who spent the last, very happily the last part of her commercial career building AI products. You'd be like, but Kendra, you'd love the idea that everybody wants to do AI right now and it's AI, all the things. Not so much, because it's leading to us spending a lot of time working on things that don't lend themselves to being solved by the tools that we have available today. But it's super easy to get swept along in the fervour of, but surely we can use AI for that. So getting to shared clarity on feasibility is a really wonderful thing, and that conversation about what's the useful task that we're actually trying to solve, really, really, really getting granular on that is a great antidote for yourself and for others who are getting swept away in AI, all the things. Surely AI is the answer to this problem too. Whoops, that's right. I had slight advance with that. And the third thing, and it really is, you'll realise, a repeat of my previous comments, but is that you really want to aim yourself, in the limited time you have on this earth, to aim at the task that needs doing. Are you measuring success against the actual task that you want to automate? If you were somebody who wanted to build AI that assisted lawyers, you're not assisting them in passing the bar exam. Perhaps you're trying to assist them in preparing case law for a client. But don't spend time working on a task that is adjacent to, but not actually the task you need to solve, because one of the glorious but also very frustrating things about building AI systems is that they are very, very task-specific. So you want relevant benchmarks that are for the holistic task. So I will get off my soapbox and talk briefly about So, okay, if you believe me and you see this, oh, yep, that makes sense, and I don't want to waste my time, and I don't want to waste my money, and I don't want to pour environmentally large amounts of water into training yet another LLM. Why are teams not consistently using relevant, useful task benchmarks today? One really big reason is they are super challenging to construct. It isn't easy. I'm not standing up here and suggesting to you that you're all, overlooking this incredibly simple thing that you could do. It's not easy at all. And the other is that there is enormous pressure to deliver, incredible pressure to take something which tends to be more working on a research type timeline, which is iterative and changeable, and it is challenging to put that against this will happen today, and this will happen tomorrow, and this will happen the next day, and that is running right into, we have a keynote, we have a presentation of new functionality on March 1st. Why? Because it's on March 1st, and so we need new functionality to drop for March 1st. So we have extraordinary pressure to deliver. Challenging to construct and a lot of pressure to deliver, you can see why people shy away from these things. But too hard to quantify, I don't know how to construct a benchmark, should be a massive red flag. Because if you think it's hard to construct a benchmark, and it often is, particularly when you're working with natural language tasks, how do you know that any of the work that you and your team are doing is actually working towards a product that's going to get any better and be at all useful? So I guess what I'm saying to you is, yeah, it's really hard, but sit in the uncomfortableness and have a crack and come up with a benchmark and go, oh, that's not a real benchmark, that's an estimate. It's like, yeah, but is any estimate better than nothing at all? I think you'll find that it is. And it also, that sitting with the pain of I can't quantify this, has a surprising ability to help you quantify it more than you thought you would be able to. So let me move from pontification to a real example. Benchmarks force clarity of thinking and a shared goal. So hard is the point. Way back in the day, when I worked for a company, Seek, that matches candidates to jobs, we wanted to use the then new techniques of deep learning to assist recruiters in finding and coming to their shortlist rapidly. Because it's great if 20 people apply for your job, you can do a wonderful job of really reading through all their resumes. If 500 people apply for your job, that becomes a genuinely challenging thing to do. So, first question we asked ourselves was what we wanted to do, assemble a shortlist of candidates for a role. What is the relevant task? And perhaps that's easiest to illustrate by suggesting what isn't. So what isn't a relevant task is trying to rank every candidate, because it actually turns out, because we tried all of these things, it actually turns out there's an enormous amount of signal in the fact that the person has applied for a job. What is the relevant task? It's not identifying who will get the job. That turns out to be almost impossible. Why? Because although there's a lot of information in a resume, there's a lot of information outside a resume that a recruiter, particularly an experienced recruiter, uses to make the decision about who to give the job to. Plus, of course, you have interviews and lots of information comes out in interviews. So when you are taking all of the applicants for a role and trying to predict who will the thing you're trying to predict is who will be shortlisted, not who will get the job. Do we have data that informs the task? In Seek's case, the answer was absolutely yes. Seek runs its own applicant tracking system because the data that you actually need to address this task is, in the past, when someone has applied for a job, who got shortlisted? And that's the bit that's actually rare. A lot of people have resume data, but not so many people have the outcomes data of who got shortlisted for a job. Do we have that? Absolutely. Do others? At the time, the answer was not so much. The answer has become more and more now yes, and so that's why you see a lot of these systems rolling out across job boards like LinkedIn. Where do we expect to top out? So this is this thing of what is the place that it is like, how good are we likely to be able to get? We thought about this one really hard for quite a while because originally you'd think, well, I want to be able to reproduce the shortlist for the job that I'm training against, right? So I've got millions millions of past jobs, millions of resumes, the job ad, the resume, the pair, and whether or not that person was shortlisted. You'd think, I want to be able to reproduce the shortlist. We were woefully incapable of doing that. What we actually realised we needed to be able to do was get as good as two humans would agree. Because if you take two recruiters, give them the same bunch of 50 resumes and ask them to tell you who they will interview, they will not pick the same group of people. So what we said is, as good as we're going to be able to get is as good as two educated recruiters would agree. So luckily we had lots of recruiters in the company, and we actually went through an exercise of getting people to shortlist the same group of candidates and put them down. And we found that the answer then, I don't know if it's still the answer now, the answer then was about 80%. If you gave two recruiters the same set of candidates for a job, their shortlist would overlap by about 80%. So that was as good as we were going to be able to get, because one individual human might expect us to be able to reproduce their exact preference, but we knew that humans' preferences differ by that much. And then the way that we figured out the other end was, actually I probably won't go into that. You can come and ask me that detail. It was a mildly technical detail. I won't go into it because I realise, running out of time. How good does it need to be useful? You need to remove obvious non-matches. Human recruiters spit the dummy if you present in a shortlist people who clearly should not be there. And we needed to capture around 80 to 90% of the candidates that the person would pick for themselves, because intuitively, actually, because they have compared with other humans in the past, that's the benchmark they have in their head. And then a final interesting one for us, and something that you guys should really consider as well, is what isn't the relevant task but looks a lot like it. And for us, that was actually, once we trained our algorithm to do a great job of shortlisting, it was released into production. It might still run, I'm not sure. Some enterprising folk in our strategy team said, well, wouldn't it be awesome? We can now take your algorithm, which is really good at picking people who are good for jobs, and we can actually go and scan the passive base of candidates that Seek maintains, and so we can give people, before they even list the job, we can give them information about who they can go and shoulder tap. Turns out that doesn't work, because it's not actually the same task, because there is something subtly built into the fact that people apply for a job that in actual fact means that when you simply try to take that same algorithm and run it across the backlog of everyone, it picks the same people all the time, and it doesn't actually work commercially as a product. So that's an example, a real life example of where we worked through this. We spent money, we spent time, and we iteratively worked on the benchmarks. Like I said, training our algorithms took somewhere between 24 hours and 4 days, and they cost a few $1,000s, I think, the bigger ones that we were working on. So it wasn't something that we wanted to try every single different iteration and just run them all and see what was happening. We really did want to have some benchmarks that would tell us when we were approaching saturation of the juice that we could squeeze. Generative AI has made this even more challenging. I have worked with lots of teams recently who are understandably super excited about using generative AI services, and why wouldn't you be? They're fun, and they open up potentially a whole different area where you can play. And they want to use them to automate or to streamline parts of existing user workflows. Unfortunately, here benchmarks can be even more ephemeral and challenging to construct, because in the case of natural language, there's both an input and an output. And you tell me, is this summary of this document better than this summary? But that hasn't changed the fact that that process of thinking hard together as a team about what a right answer might be is, if anything, more important. The most common outcome I've seen in the last 6 to 9 months of getting a team to actually sit down together to nut out what their useful task benchmarks are is actually, as we mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, that they aren't yet clear on what the useful task is. So you have to overcome a little bit of negative pressure to even get folk to sit down and think about it, because they kind of know in the backs of their heads it's going to be really hard to quantify what a good answer looks like. But what I actually find is when I do get folk to sit down together and say, cool, let's have a think about what's a useful benchmark, the first thing they actually discover, they're not working on the right task yet. And so they go through that iterative loop of one reason we can't construct a benchmark is we're actually not collectively clear on what the useful task we're working on is. Now, there's one other subtle trap here for folks who have come new to AI, which I imagine at least some of you in the audience have, and you've come new to AI specifically through generative AI services. Many of you, I'm sure, and certainly many people entering into AI product development at this time, have decently long careers in software engineering, and boy, do we need those people, because these systems are hard to build and they're hard to keep running effectively and cost effectively. However, if you have a decently long career in software development, I'll call it application software development for distinction, deep in your bones, you have a feeling, played out through your successful career so far, that once you have a system that gives you the right answer a few times in a row, you have a system that is fundamentally going to work, and the rest, however time-consuming, and I'm not saying it isn't time-consuming, however time-consuming and tedious, is turning that working idea into a hardened version that you can put into production and run reasonably well. However, with generative AI, that intuition works against you, because it is entirely possible to have a system that gives you the right answer a few times in a row and never has any possibility of actually working to an extent that you can use it in production. And it's something, again, I see teams trip up over all the time. So I would leave that one with you as well. And my plea to you is that, sure, generative AI has made construction of benchmarks and construction of useful tasks harder than it was before, but don't give in to evaluation by vibe. There are so many teams out there doing evaluation by vibe, and you're like, I don't want to be the user of your product when it falls over. So some tips for constructing your own benchmarks, if I've at least motivated you to say, yeah, all right, I listened to that chick for half an hour, maybe I'll give it a go. Start from the outside in. So this is a reiteration of things I've already said, but I'm trying to sort of summarize them into a takeaway. So start from the outside in. It's almost certainly not the first task you think it is, the one that's just the AI. What you need to make work is a broader thing that fits inside a useful workflow that your users already do. Definitely go and talk to the intended end users. I know that sounds very trite, and I know you're like, oh, of course we do, but people don't. They really genuinely don't. Sometimes because they think those users are hard to find. Sometimes because they've listened too much to Henry Ford and they're like, what is it? Any colour you like as long as it's white, or whatever it is. The consumer doesn't know what they want. And often just because they find those people difficult to find, or they're worried about the small number statistics problem. But go and talk to the users, the people who actually do the task you want. There is nothing more useful in figuring out whether what you're working on is a useful task or whether what you're working on is what you think that person's job is. Be prepared to spend both some time and some money. So I absolutely have and absolutely will again spend time and money recruiting people to do the thing I need them to do, getting them to do the thing I need them to do, buying the results, buying the market research, compared to the development time of your very expensive development team. Paying some money to build a benchmark is definitely worth it. And the other thing I'd say is, don't be scared off by the fact that when you first sit down and go, particularly in natural language, I really don't know what a good answer is going to look like. Put something basic in place and change it. It is better to have something that you can then start to become frustrated with, and in the back of your head when you're in the shower and you're having a sleep, whatever, you go, I've figured out one way to make it slightly better. Start with, here are 10 answers, here are 10 questions, here are 10 answers. That is a pretty rudimentary place to start, but it's better than not starting with anything at all. So put something basic in place as your best guess of useful, as your best guess of something to measure your output against, and just change it as you go. So I have given myself time for questions, which I'm very pleased about because I do tend to talk too long. Thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you for the sun rising and setting several times during the talk. And as I said before, I am super keen to answer your questions, so please bring it on. It's very disco, Nick. Very disco.
Thank you very much, Kendra. That was a lovely talk. Could we have the house lights up slightly so that I can see the audience? Because I'll need to see people raising their hands. I have 2 runners running around microphones, and I might just trust my microphone runners to find people who are convenient to give the microphone to and put their hand up. And I can see someone has been handed a microphone over here, if we can take a question.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you wave your hand? Because I hate moving. Thank
hi.
you.
Yeah, hi. When you were talking about benchmarks, it was very reminiscent to me of work I had done in the past regarding automation in the context of weather forecasting and needing to know what the question you were trying to answer about what is good enough is as you developed models and compared with what human forecasters did.
Yeah.
We weren't using AI or machine learning or anything in there, it was just different forms of modelling. So to what extent do you think what you're saying about benchmarks and what is good enough and how good you can get are actually just very general things about any modelling activity of trying to represent the world, of which AI is just another case?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I did the same thing when I was an experimental physicist, firing lasers at ultra-cold atoms. So yeah, take an idea that works and apply it to a different field, for sure. I agree with you. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
All right, question from over here.
Hello. Thanks a lot for the talk. I find it really insightful.
Cool.
My question is, all AI technologies right now sort of do not work on a changing world. It requires that the data of tomorrow is the same as the data of today. So in your experience, how would you incorporate change into the benchmark, especially regarding biases of humans, because we don't necessarily want to repeat the mistakes of people.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really complicated question, so there's a lot packed in there. I'm not entirely sure that you're right about there's no applications of AI where they won't continue to work. I think there are. I think you have to be very cautious about what they are. The problem that you're talking about is often called drift. So the data underlying or the expectations underlying what you're doing changes and you need to update your model. A really obvious one with drift is when you're making models about financial markets and the financial markets change and you need to update your models. So I think what you should do is have a really sensible and careful think about whether the application you're working on is one that is going to be impacted by drift, and if it is, on what timescale. Because you might say, yeah, realistically, idiom is important, so as the English language changes and new words come into it, or any language that you happen to be working in, we're going to need to retrain our models every 2 to 5 years. Or you might say, we have seasonal drift, and so we're going to need to change our models every quarter because of the seasons. Or you might say we have market condition drift, so as the RBA changes the interest rates, we're going to need to retrain our models. So it's an important thing to know about the space that you're working in and set a retrain threshold on a time frame that makes sense for your application. The third thing you mentioned there was, what about bias? Absolutely. What about bias? One thing I got to the point of saying at Seek when people would tell me to build an unbiased model, because you can imagine with recruiting, you'd like an unbiased model. I got a little frustrated with some of my strategy colleagues and I said to them, first show me an unbiased world. So show me a fair world and I'll build you a fair model. So I don't disagree with anyone who says that there's bias in machine learning models, but I do think, it's getting better today. The conversation 4 years ago used to be your model is biased, and the answer, of course, is no, that's not true. The base, well, partially true, but the base data that you're training on is biased. So there are techniques for specifically removing biases that you are aware of, and ones that are really important to you, thank you, you should pay attention to. I think where a lot of people are going today is trying to identify and mitigate the biases that we know exist. But realistically, there is no way that you can remove bias from most algorithms. So I think a good approach, and certainly an approach I take today, is to be as aware as I can of what they might be and work around them and mitigate them where we can. But it's one of the reasons that I think we need to think really carefully as a society. And I fear that we're not, but I'll say to all of you that go out and be those voices, we need to think really carefully as a society as where we should use algorithms. Not to say that people aren't biased as well. So it is a really, really complicated moral and ethical question. Do we have time for one more question? I just got the 5 minutes, but yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'd like to talk about augmentation, so it's not necessarily just a computer doing, but helping a human, and also talking to the end user. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts or tips about how you tell the end user to, the risk of them taking what they're shown as gospel, or maybe the inverse, where the first time they see a bad answer, they never look at it again and they dismiss it. Do you have any thoughts or tips about how you tell them to interpret it and have a critical eye and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it's something that we're seeing play out in front of us, right? Because nobody has a good answer for this. We see now a lot of the LLM chatbots will put up like disclaimers at the top and disclaimers at the bottom. Some of them do it better than others. Go and have a look at the way Claude does it. They're probably the ones who are doing it the most carefully at the moment. That's Anthropic's chatbot, right? I find it really alarming when I talk to people who tell me that they believe LLMs are thinking, or that they believe LLMs are retrieving information. And so I do spend a lot of my time, raindrops on something or other. I'm sure it's a pointless exercise, but trying to explain to people so they have at least a little bit of an understanding of how these models work. I think we're all going to learn together about how that comes true. Perhaps what makes me feel a little confident is I don't really know, and I don't know everyone in the world, but I don't really know anyone that I can think of who believes that they go to Google, they Google, and they believe what comes back. So somehow, as a collective human species, we picked up the idea that web search is not always going to be accurate. We have a bigger hurdle to overcome, I believe, with things like Perplexity and OpenAI, because there's something hardwired in our brains that when a thing, be it human or in this case, of course, non-human, is extremely articulate, uses perfect grammar and never makes a spelling mistake, I think we have it really hardwired into us to equate eloquence with intelligence, which of course is not true. So we're having a real issue here because we've trained ourselves as a species to believe that form and content kind of go together, and we're now needing to learn that they don't. I worry most about what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months as people equilibrate themselves to this concept of this thing. I describe it as a cheerful and excited 8-year-old. I loved my children, but I did not believe everything that came out of their mouths when they were 8, not because I thought they were trying to deceive me, but because they were 8. So I think we'll get to a point where we all go, oh yeah, but that's a chatbot, but that's an LLM, whatever. What I worry about a bit is the harm that might occur in the intergum, in the period where we get used to understanding how to work with these things. Design patterns will emerge, I'm sure, and I have a couple of friends who are designers, and I love talking to them about what do you think the right design patterns for us to interact with these things are? And I don't think anybody's cracked that yet. So I think it's a really, really interesting place for research, and it's something that we're all going to need to watch and learn. And maybe one of you will figure it out. And I've just been told I have 1 minute. So I guess that means we have no more time for questions. But thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Kendra. Before you leave the stage, I have one more thing for you, Kendra. I have this wonderful speaker gift to say thank you. Please accept this Pycon AU mug.
Fantastic. I was just saying how much I love the logo, so that's awesome. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm glad you liked it. Thank you very much, Kendra.